The metal is cold against the skin. You feel it first as a weight, then as a promise. A silver faceplate, cut to the span of a boy's features, rests where a smile once sat. Cloth is wrapped tight beneath it, linen scorched with oil, bandages edge-stained by ointments and sweat. Breath fogs in the slit of eye holes. Each inhale tastes of horse, unguents, and something older, iron, the hot tang of readiness. November 25, 1177. The plain near Montgisard lies low under a thin sunlight. Far off, the bulk of Saladin's army moves like a dark sea. By the most generous reckonings chroniclers would later give, it numbers in the tens of thousands. The defenders in Jerusalem send out less than 1,000 men who are in full armor, roughly 500 mounted knights with their retinues and a scattering of infantry. On paper, the math is obscene. On paper, the city is doomed. If you like this kind of close reading of history, slow, textured, and willing to let the human moment stand at the center of grand events, subscribe and hit the bell so we can keep uncovering the stories that changed the world. They had not chosen this day for glory. Baldwin IV had chosen it because the alternative was worse. He was young, and young in a way that made the court uneasy. His face bore the small, familiar angles of adolescence and the brushed hair that no longer hid the signs beneath. Leprosy, the chroniclers state, had claimed him like a slow winter, hands stiffening, flesh betraying him in ways that frightened courtiers and bishops alike. He wore his illness as other men wore armor, not to advertise weakness, but to make it part of how he was seen in public. The king's mask surfaces first in the memory because it is a symbol that mattered to contemporaries and to those who wrote after. They record a silver mask, polished, solemn, catching dawn like a second sun. We cannot hear Baldwin's thoughts. We can reconstruct gaze and gesture from the accounts left to us. When chroniclers say a king smiled, they give us the most human of gestures and the least certain truth. Still, the image feels sharp under the blink of winter light, a boy king with a metal face stepping out of the chamber into command. Baldwin's counselors counseled restraint. Raymond of Tripoli argued for conservation, hold the walls, collect the women and the food, send scouts farther, refuse battle until reinforcements could be mustered. Odo, the great-haired Grand Master of the Templars, is recorded in the chronicles as a man of fierce certainty. One imagines his voice low and clipped, his hands used to the heft of sword and standard. We cannot meet them on the open plain, his advisers insisted. Our numbers will be ground down. Yet something in Baldwin moved differently. Chroniclers and later historians debate motive. Some read it as despair, some as strategy, some as a king's logic sharpened by the knowledge of his own mortality. He had an advantage that was invisible on the muster rolls. His disease, in a cruel twist, removed from him the small, paralyzing calculus that grips most men in the moment of greatest danger, the reflex of self-preservation. He could not feel pain as others did. He could harness a will unbent by instinctive fear. Whether he knew how to turn that into a military tool, or whether he simply rode with the force of a desperate heart, is partly conjecture. The chroniclers suggest he understood the theatricality of kingship. A visible commitment can carry other men along. They rode out with a handful of steel and the loud pulse of desperate hope. The march toward the place where Saladin's army encamped was not a neat parade. It was a ragged, tense movement of men unused to large formations, clutching the reins in hands wrapped for warmth and for protection. Scouts returned with reports that told of an army spread thin, some columns foraging for supplies, others drawn toward the east after raids. Saladin trusted his numbers and the flexibility of his detachments. He would later write, or be reported as having written in the tone of a proud commander, that he meant to teach the Franks a lesson, how to live with the fear of desert raiders and how to recover passes and caravans. He did not expect a king to appear on the field like a spearhead. You are one of those knights. Your helm is open and cold. Your cheeks crack at the corners with the wind. Your saddle creaks. Your horse smells of sweat and straw.
You have heard that your king is sick. You have seen him in the hall, his hands bandaged, the way he rises stiffly from the bench, the way his eyes fix on things beyond your seeing. Still, when you see him now, with the silver mask strapped to his face, when you see him mount with the small economy of movement a soldier learns under pressure, your spine straightens. He is a living proof that courage is chosen. There are practicalities that matter more than image. Baldwin's plan, as the best reconstructions allow, is audacious, because it makes a weak point into a strength. Rather than meet Saladin on a level plane where his numbers would be decisive, Baldwin intends to funnel the larger force into terrain that narrows movement and breaks cohesion. Ravines, ridges, defiles where a mass cannot outflank a wedge. The Templars and the secular knights would act as a wedge. Baldwin's men move fast, striking at a flank that thought itself secure. Some chroniclers, writing decades later, frame it as divine favor. Others frame it as the rare combination of timing, audacity, and Saladin's temporary dispersion. The march tightens into a single-minded rhythm: hoofbeat, breath, the clink of chain, the slap of leather. The men whisper prayers, vow to
God, and to the Virgin, if they are of the Latins. A priest says a brief benediction and sets his cross. A paltry choir to millions. Still, in that sealed world between saddle and spear, voices drop and a new economy of attention emerges. To the horse, to the ground, to the man beside you. When the call finally comes, it is with an immediacy that cleaves thought. Trumpets. A single shout, then another. The formation moves. The commander rides at the head. Baldwin's face in its silver is at once anonymous and entirely his. Sun cuts across metal. The mask glitters. The motif repeats. Mask at the council. Mask as he mounts. Mask catching light as the charge begins. Symbols work because they are simple and repeated. Now the voice slides into second person because immediacy demands it. You feel the air push past as the column shortens. Lance points forward like forest trunks. You pull in breath. You taste dust. You hear the hooves. First a rumble, then an avalanche. Short sentences take over. They hammer rhythm into the reader's body as they had into the writer's ears. Hooves, drum, breath, metal, scream, breathe, forward. You see them before you hear them, riders from Saladin's flank, cavalry thrown together to meet an attack. Their mass looks unending. Their banners are a sea of dark cloth. Their horsemen lean and practiced. But they come with the confidence of numbers and the momentary complacency of those who assume the enemy will flee before them. Baldwin's strike, however, is not a simple head-on collision. It is a wedge that drives into a fold in the lines where the earth itself gives way. Ravines, stony gullies that become choke points. Horses come down the slope in panicked slides. Men drop, armor catching and tearing, not in a description of gore, but in the sad, efficient ending of a life that is stopped by terrain and surprise. The large army cannot pivot swiftly. It cannot reform. Saladin's men are not merely beat by steel. They are found wanting by logistics. Detachments eat up time for foraging and reassembly. Commanders scramble. Confusion, more than courage or valor, decides battles more often than the chroniclers liked to admit. Baldwin places his small force in the one place where confusion will amplify rather than diminish his effect. The geometry of the ground becomes a weapon. Push. Someone, imagined, reconstructed, might have said. Tie your sword to your hand, a captain advises. Chroniclers mention tricks of armor and grip. They mention how some knights, weakened by the disease or by injury, had to fasten their weapons lest they slip. Whether this was widespread or only a few cases is the sort of detail lost to us. The image of a soldier tying his sword to his hand because he cannot trust his fingers in the crush survives as a powerful emblem of improvisation. The noise tightens into a single consonant, a raw, terrible clang, bark. The world reduces to contact. Steel bites leather. Horses fling themselves into the press. You are shoved, you shove back. You feel weight. You smell blood, but not vividly. Language here stays impressionistic. Warm, copper-skin scent, not anatomical exactness. Men fall. Some do not cry out because they cannot trust that noise will change the present. Then, and here chroniclers are unanimous in their astonishment, Saladin's line falters. The momentum of his attack, the confidence of a commander used to commanding, becomes its weakness. Here is one of history's thin hinges. An exposed flank, a king with a mask and a cavalry wedge, a geography that swallows mass. The great army cannot be a single organism when it is fragmented by ravine and panic. The weight of numbers becomes a liability. Men, centuries later, would call it miracle. Others would call it chance made decisive by a stubborn will. In the immediate moments that follow, the rout takes shape. Horses scramble into ravines. Columns become knotted. The Templars fight like iron in a press, and their discipline rubs away the cohesion of the attackers. Saladin's men try to withdraw in order, but find that order implodes into 1,000 frightened decisions. The plain, so confident in its capacity to hold an army, becomes a place of holes and traps and sudden small deaths. You watch Baldwin. The silver mask gleams. He rides as if he cannot feel the caress of wind or the bruise of a horse's flank. He cannot. That inability, the cruel reductive element of his illness, had a paradoxical effect. It allowed him to press into places other men would not, to look at the face of danger without flinching. Whether he felt triumph in that instant or only a mechanical satisfaction at the unfolding of strategy is beyond record. We can imagine the king's jaw set, the eyes bright in the slit of the mask, the small human twist at the corner of mouth that might have been a smile. Chroniclers record such gestures with the same mixture of piety and astonishment. This prince, who should not have stood at the head of an army, did so, and the world tilted. Saladin retreats, not in total collapse, but enough. His forces, damaged and scattered, fall back to regroup. The Crusaders hold the field. The immediate outcome is dramatic and unambiguous. A narrow band of Franks have broken the larger army's hold on the region and saved Jerusalem from immediate, catastrophic assault. The numbers historians cite in later retellings, 500 knights against 26,000, tend to be rhetorical devices, used by medieval and modern chroniclers to emphasize the miracle. They overstate certainty, yet the imbalance is real enough to make the victory a feast of improbable success. In the after-hours, the plain is a study in exhausted textures. Armor rubbing leather, the creak of saddles abandoned and set down like closed books. The silver mask is set aside and wiped by a hand that trembles. The motif returns, mask in council, mask in charge, mask in quiet after the fight. The king feels the cost. Leprosy does not pause for victory. The disease, like a slow corrosion, continues to take small things, the sensation in a fingertip, the clarity of a hand's grip. The triumph sits beside the tragedy, intimately attached. The immediate cost to Saladin is tactical and temporary. He withdraws to lick wounds and to gather men. The long-term consequence is different. The victory at Montgisard delayed his plans and brightened the legend of the Crusader states. Yet it also accelerated Baldwin's decline by throwing him into the very exertions that his body could scarcely sustain. Political consequences unfurl slowly: court maneuvering, the fraying of alliances, questions about succession. Soldiers and peasants return to their fields, while nobles consider the fragile architecture that holds a realm together: honor, marriage alliances, borrowed money, the thin thread of reputation. And through all this, a thesis begins to assert itself in the mind that watches history from the vantage of distance: that a single person's will, harnessed and visible, can act as a catalytic agent upon probability. Baldwin's commitment, performative, visible, unavoidable, did what numbers and logistics could not by themselves accomplish. It made men act as if the outcome were otherwise. It converted fear into momentum. Not every such gamble succeeds. Most fail. But the ones that do succeed bend trajectories. At the same time, another lesson resists easy moralization. Saladin was not vanquished for lack of capacity. He was checked by circumstance and human calculation. He retreated not because of cowardice, but because of prudence, a pause to rebuild strength. He would later recover political and military posture in ways that would change the map fundamentally. So the triumph at Montgisard is both luminous and provisional. It buys time rather than eternity. A small scene. Baldwin walks among the wounded. He touches, with a glove, the shoulder of a knight whose eye is swollen shut. The knight looks up. You do not get melodrama here. Instead, you get the ordinary, awkward human exchange that follows terror. A hand on the shoulder, a nod, a whispered thanks. The king's hand, bandaged and numb, is an emblem of dignified decay and stubborn tenderness. That image will be remembered precisely because it resists tidy categorization. Chroniclers of the time called the day both miracle and strategy. They invoked God in one breath and the cold fact of ground in the next. William of Tyre and later Arabic chroniclers record the astonishment, each through the contour of their own loyalties. We, looking back across the centuries, are left to stitch explanation from fragments. The disease that made the king fearless, the geography that punished the many, the timing that ensured Saladin's forces would be fragmented when the blow fell. By dusk, the plain keeps its injuries but not its pattern. Men count the living.
In small, stunned groups. The chorus of the dead is not described in clinical terms. Rather, the landscape seems to shrink around the living as if to hold them like a memory. Baldwin rides slowly, mask in place, as if the metal gives him a permission to be both king and sick man. The mask, having flashed at dawn and at the head of a charge, now reflects the low sun and the soft grief of survivors. Once more it is the emblem that binds the scene, a sunlight on metal image that will be retold by scribes with pen and with imagination. The victory is decisive for that day. The aftermath seeds longer stories. Baldwin's health will worsen. Political factions will rise and fall. Saladin will, in time, reassert himself and achieve victories that overturn the fragile world the Franks still held. But the essential lesson of Montgisard, that will, when made visible and coordinated with terrain and timing, can collapse the expectation built by numbers, lingers. It does not generalize into a rule for all of history. It insists only on a narrow truth. Contingency exists, and singular human choices can, under the right conditions, pivot events. We leave the field not with a hero's unalloyed triumph, but with a sense that history is an accumulation of brittle victories and durable costs. Baldwin has won a day he could not afford to lose. He has also expended himself in doing so. His silver mask will appear again in memory. The ravines that became killing wells will hold the echo of hoofbeats. Saladin will withdraw and rebuild. Men will tell the story in pious terms or strategic terms, depending on the speaker's taste. What remains, for us watching centuries later, is a lesson about probability and courage. That improbable outcomes sometimes occur, and that we should not confuse the possibility of such events with a moral warrant to court risk lightly. The plain cools. The king removes his gauntlet and tests his fingers, feeling still the numb line where sensation lessens. He smiles, perhaps beneath the mask. The smile may be real. It may be what a king owes his men, a look that says, however briefly, that they have not been abandoned. If you want to go deeper into the logistics and the aftermath, the strategic recalibrations in Damascus, the long arc of Baldwin's decline, and how this single day reshaped the calculus between two empires, stay with us. There are documents and eyewitness fragments worth unpacking, and the next layer of the story shows how a single victory can feel like triumph and yet be the precursor to greater loss. What follows from Montgisard is not a single, tidy narrative, but a braided set of motions, councils and repairs, proclamations and quiet deaths, rides between fortresses and whispered accusations at the palace threshold. To read the aftermath is to watch governors stitch torn banners, and to see rulers measure their fortunes against the cost of
men and horses. In Damascus, Saladin receives the news with the outward calm that turns the judgments of historians into puzzles. He whips a horse and rides east. He summons emirs and captains, and in the courtyard of the citadel the talk is of reinforcements and of avoiding the same mistakes twice. He will not, the chroniclers say, deny the loss. The slaughter at the ravines cut a wide wound through his army. But neither will he allow pity to arrest the state's motion. Where grief might breed haste, he prefers deliberation. He sends scouts to learn how the Franks had come upon them, which roads were used, how baggage trains had been placed, whether the column had been stretched by foraging or by false confidence. He counts not only the dead, but the manner of their death, for patterns guide armies as much as courage. The councils in Damascus are a study in reconstitution. Commanders who had been scattered are gathered, horses reshod, lances reforged. There are also negotiations in rooms where carpet muffles the voice and wine is offered more for quiet than for celebration. Emissaries are dispatched to allies in Aleppo and to tribal leaders who control the passes. Money changes hands. Promises are made of grain and of fighters. A commander who will later shape the campaigns to come speaks plainly of fortifications. Where a fortress can be repaired, a garrison must hold. Where it cannot, the plan is to deny the Franks a foothold by attrition, by harrying columns, and by using the long manifold of supply to advantage. The aim is not immediate revenge for a day's humiliation, but the slow correction of strategic imbalance. Back in Jerusalem, the injured are tended with a mixture of devotional care and the blunt medicine of the age. They are laid on rushes in churches and in the makeshift wards of the leper hospital. Priests bend over them and apply oil and prayer, while barber surgeons cut and stitched with a hand steadied by necessity. The king returns to a court in which ceremony masks anxiety. Baldwin rides through lanes where people have left bread and water at doors. He dismounts in the palace and lets attendants unfasten the cuirass that has become its own kind of identity. The mask is taken off in private now, set aside on a table like a thing that has done its work and can be treated as an object rather than an emblem. For the king, the mask has been both armor and talisman. To lay it down is to expose what remains, a face growled at by illness and yet composed in the effort not to alarm. That composition is political as much as personal. The victory at Montgisard gives Baldwin bargaining power, and he uses it. Envoys ride from Jerusalem with sealed letters and folded commissions. Some bear thanks and others bear threats. The Templars and Hospitalitors return to their halls full of wounded men and of gold. Recruits whose courage has been tested. Their masters meet with the council to press demands, more patrols, stricter oversight of the borders, reparations from towns that had failed to send men. These demands are not only practical but also symbolic. The military orders understand that their order's reputation is measured by action, not by sermon. To be defenders now is to press the king on the point of recovery, calling for bold measures that the court must resist or adopt. The court resists and adopts both. Factions harden with the shape of the wound. Some barons, seeing that Baldwin's health declines, press for a regency or the crowning of a successor. Prudence, they claim, in case the king's body succumbs to what his face already signs. Others insist that to set up a rival now is to invite foreign interference and to fracture the fragile unity carved from years of hazard. There are whispers about marriages and betrothals, about alliances that would secure quick men and a stable line. There are also voices of a very different sort, men who want to press the advantage, to strike while Saladin gathers himself and while the memory of the ravines blackens the mind of his followers. It is the old argument, to pursue the ruined foe and hope the tide breaks, or to shore up what remains and avoid overreach. Between those poles, Baldwin moves with a measure that the chroniclers find hard to name. He is not merely a sick man acting out of gallantry. He is a ruler who understands that any triumph can be hollow if it leaves the polity thinner than before. He calls for repairs to the city walls and for the strengthening of garrison rotations at key passes. He orders the mending of bridges and the clearing of roads used by caravans so that supplies can flow without being harried. He approves small, targeted raids to keep Saladin's scouts uneasy, but refuses a full field army unless the odds are substantially improved. That prudence costs him some of the praise of the warlike, but it buys something else: time, which a sick king values as much as a healthy one. Time in this chapter of the Levant is the kind of currency that favors the patient. Saladin uses it to bind together patronage networks. Baldwin uses it to patch a kingdom's seams. Yet time is also the enemy of bodies. Baldwin's decline is not sudden so much as relentless. The disease that marks him is the subject not only of pity, but of rumor. Some say it is God's test. Others, more cruelly, see it as a sign of divine displeasure. For the king, the disease has a private geography, days in which his limbs cooperate and days in which they betray him. He writes, when his hand allows, brief directives. He signs, when the fever subsides, land grants to monasteries and small reliefs for widows of those who fell at Montgisard. These acts reveal a ruler trying to secure spiritual and temporal legacies simultaneously. The chroniclers, Latin and Arabic, take different shapes from these events, and each version serves its own audience. William of Tyre frames Baldwin's victory as providence. The chronicle's language leans toward miracle, toward the idea that a sick king's body could be the instrument of God when will and occasion coincide. Arabic accounts, written in cities from Damascus to Cairo, turn slightly the lens. Saladin's retreat is soberly explained in terms of logistics and season, with lament but without fatalism. The net result is two memory threads that will not be easily reconciled. Men will retell Montgisard sometimes as a miracle, sometimes as a hard lesson in maneuver. Both read together offer a fuller truth than either can claim alone. There are subtler consequences as well. The battle's aftermath changes the calculus of allegiance among local lords. Small lords who had hedged between the Franks and their neighbors now reassess. Some reattach themselves to Jerusalem's court for the safety of its walls. Others exchange oaths with neighboring emirs, preferring proximity to the new center of gravity. Trade follows, in fits and starts. Merchants test the roads, carrying salt and cloth and spare metal. The taxes they pay will be crucial to the next season's recruitment. The king's fiscal ministers tighten accounts. They strain, in private, against the knowledge that every soldier fed is a purse emptied. Montgisard also produces prisoners, and those prisoners become bargaining chips. A noble taken from Saladin's ranks is brought to the king's presence and exchanged, not always for like status, sometimes for grain or for a promise to release a held caravan. The practice is old, almost ritual: hostage for hostage, ransom for ransom. A few of the captive men are presented to the court. Their faces are not in the books that will be written later, but their stories travel in rumor. Who paid ransom, who refused, who was used as an envoy to justify a truce. These small transactions knit a web of mutual restraint until someone breaks it, and someone will break it. History is not content with stasis. The wounds sustained on the plain will become points of leverage in later years. The king's body, taxed by campaign and by illness, becomes less able to serve as the anchor of authority. Men who seek office and territory begin to plan for futures that will not include Baldwin as active ruler. The orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, watch the court and measure urgency differently from civilian ministers, their ethos shaped by vows and by a martial calendar. Their masters consult with one another and with foreign houses. Europe hears, in fragments, of a king who wore a silver mask into battle. Such images travel the Christian world and become a kind of legend that belies the gritty realities on the ground. Saladin, for his part, does not yield to either despair or haste. He consolidates, he recruits.
He uses the memory of Montgisard as both wound and lesson. Where once a frontal assault may have seemed the obvious course, He now considers sieges and the cutting of supplies, measures that will test the endurance of fortresses rather than the valor of knights alone. He cultivates his alliance with merchants and with tribal leaders whose knowledge of passes and wells exceeds that of any Frankish lord. He learns, perhaps more swiftly than some of his opponents, that the Levant is not only a place of pitched glory, but also of patient attrition. From a distance, Montgisard reads as a pivot. The Franks bought decades of peace in some sectors, but they also accelerated the internal debates that would shape their survival. For every field patched and every fortress repaired, there is an unseen tally of grief and of spirited men who will not ride again. The Victories' shine cannot fully disguise that cost. When the candles are drawn and the council breaks, Baldwin walks alone for a while in the palace gardens where olive trees shade a path worn by years of man and beast. He thinks, perhaps, of the men he touched in the field, of the eye swollen with dirt, and of the voice that had whispered thanks. He lays his palm on the bark of an olive as if to feel a steadier pulse. Somewhere beyond the walls, the horizon holds the possibility of both safety and new danger. Saladin will return, or he will send another captain. Men will die, or they will live, and the balance will shift again. The day ends as days do in that country, with the small rites of the household, with the clink of dishes in kitchens, with prayers murmured in chapels, and with the low noise of servants moving through oil lamps. For now, Montgisard belongs to the memory of a people who were both saved and spent. There is a fragile peace that follows great exertion, full of cautious talk and the requisite preparations for the next season. The map of the Levant is not redrawn in a single afternoon, nor is the fate of kingdoms decided by one man's courage alone. Yet in that afternoon, under a low sun that gilds a silver mask, the course of years shifted. Men would remember the choice Baldwin made to go forward despite ailment. They would also remember the ways the victory required them to pay. Beyond the palace and the camps, beyond the charts drawn by chroniclers and the small inventories kept by quartermasters, the ordinary people resume their lives and carry with them the stories that will be told at hearths and in the marketplaces. A woman will spin a thread about the king's face behind the mask. A child will mimic the sound of hooves. An old man will speak in the market of the way the ravine took the horses and how nature itself joined in the making of battle. These are the human
stitches that hold history together, not only maps and treaties, but the remembered sensations of a day, the taste of dust, the ringing of steel, the smell of blood, the bruised laughter afterward. So Montgisard settles into its place in memory, a day of light for some, a warning for others, and an occasion for the slow weaving of policy and of rumor that defines politics in any age. The plain cools, but already men on both sides of the lines prepare for the arduous work of what will come next. When the council reassembled 2 days later, the palace chamber smelled of lemon oil and warmed wax. The same faces sat about the table, though some had changed. A marshal who had ridden from a distant garrison, a steward with papers bound in leather, 2 brothers in white surcoats who bore the cross of a military house. They spoke in measured tones, because measured tones were safer than rash cries, and because the king's infirmity made every word heavy with consequence. Baldwin listened, his hand resting on the carved arm of his seat. The silver mask lay upon the table like a small, bright argument. There were, plainly, 2 logics in the room. One, held by those whose lives were given to the sword, still believed in the cure of a great stroke of arms, a strike against some exposed flank of Saladin's domains, a bloody show that would restore fear and bind together wavering lords. In their speech, the language of honor and revenge mixed with the ledger of men lost and banners shamed. They counted what could be taken and what must be paid in men. The other logic was shaped by those who measured strength in walls and stores, governors who knew the cost of a long winter, commanders of castles whose eyes were on wells and grain rather than on glory.
Between them stood the Knights Hospitaller and the Templars, each with its own temper. The Templars' voice was hard as iron. The Hospitallers was tempered by patience names and by lists of who might live if the roads remained open. Ministers pressed on coins and levies. "We cannot keep men in the field forever," an elder muttered, and the whisper of truth went round like an unwanted coin. A steward unrolled a parchment, a tally of repairs needed for the towers at Tyre and for the stocks of fire-saw wood at Ascalon. A captain spoke of passes that had been watched since winter, of guides who knew where the wells lay in the long, dry stretches. Names were spoken, of barons who would not ride unless promised fief and favor, of younger sons who saw in Baldwin's sickness an opportunity, of merchants who, when courtyards were safe, would keep trade moving and coin flowing. He could have been flattered by the flattery or angered by the scheming. Baldwin had learned the pattern of both. For a while he simply sat and made them speak.
And in their speaking the kingdom exposed its seams. Then he asked quietly, in a voice that had the small, surprising strength of a man who had practiced command under pain, who would take charge of the defenses while he tended the court and the sick. Names were offered, some with heat, some with caution. The king's eyes, when they turned to one who carried the weight of a county to the north, held something like relief. Baldwin spoke of an oath. He asked that the men swear to him not merely fealty, but a charge to the people. No castles to be abandoned, no villages to be left without watch, and that the bread and the salt be kept in the granaries. Outside the palace, the city moved under a sky slightly cooler than the day of battle. Women carried water in jars. Boys ran with a stick-borne banner, imitating a cavalry charge made real only in their shouts. The market hummed, and among the stall-keepers, talk of Montgisard had given way to the more pressing conversation of harvest and tolls. A chronicler in a hooded cloak bent over a page and wrote with a tremor of joy and fear. The plain had been won, but the plain was only a day. He wrote of the king who had worn a mask, and of the men who had ridden for the cause. Later, sailors would carry his lines back to Italy and to the courts of France, and they would read them as ingredient for myth. Baldwin's decision was not the final settling of matters. Kings did not, then or now, choose all outcomes in a single breath. Yet he sought to bind a forward course with a small, particular act. He called for engineers and for masons. He ordered watch beacons to be set along ridge and ruin. He dispatched riders with sealed letters to fortresses that sat like teeth along the coast and the inland roads. To the count of a northern fort he entrusted the keeping of a pass. To a knight newly returned from pilgrimage he gave a small band and charged him with moving powder and iron where need was greatest. These were administrative moves, the cold furniture of strategy, but each would matter the least as the months lengthened. He also sent envoys beyond the sea. The western shores knew little of the subtleties that bound Levantine polities. A man could win a field and still lose the war by the slow politics of allegiance. Baldwin's letters were not petitions of weakness, but explanations of necessity, of castles that required men, of commanders who would go unpaid unless coin came. Those who would read in the courts of France and of Sicily would see both the need and the opportunity. Pay now or send men later when the task would be harder. In quieter hours, when the petitions were done and the council had dispersed, Baldwin would go to the chapel. There, the lances of candlelight feathered across painted saints and chipped stone, and he would take off the mask and lay it by the altar, as if to place it at the feet of something sturdier than a crown. His voice was small in prayer. It did not petition for long life or miraculous cure so plainly as once it might have. Instead, he asked, if he asked at all, that the men and women of his rule be kept. He thought of the boy who mimicked hooves and of the old man who spoke of ravines. These faces, blurred and particular at once, were the object of his kingship as much as any border tract. Far from the palace, in the camps of Saladin, different roads were being traced. The Sultan read the news brought by scouts and from merchants who crossed his markets. He did not prize every rumor. He prized patterns, the slow gathering of stores, the tightening of watch, the repair of fortresses. In his council he spoke of patience as if it were a weapon. Where some of his captains chafed for open battle, Saladin pointed to the long play, to the choked supply line, to a castle whose well might be taken, to the commerce that, strangled, would bleed the Franks more effectively than a pitched field. His men set about establishing small detachments, carting food and water stores toward places that might be choked. They sought alliances with local emirs whose knowledge of the passes and of the people would give them an advantage in days measured by months. So a new season began to take its shape. The plain had been a single burning page, and now the book opened to a chapter of endurance. Knights who had tasted victory rode to mend armor and to count the cost of horses. Captains at watchtowers measured their stores and sent reports that traveled slowly by mule and faster by rumor. In villages, parents taught children again the names of safe wells and of routes to the walled towns. Some who had lost kin grieved in the evening by firelight, while others stitched the arrow holes in a coat or scraped rust from a spear. Politics, meanwhile, threaded its equal, less visible influence. Ambition is a patient thing. It waits through months of repair and tends itself in small, private bargains. Men who had not yet pledged, those who wanted title, those who wanted the king's favor for their sons, watched Baldwin as if waiting for the final signal. They counted how often he rode and how often he rested, and made calculations about marriages and alliances that would give them steadier ground when the next crisis came. Yet for all the wheels of calculation, for all the strategies, and for all the shoring up of walls and wills, there remained the human hardness of living by rhythm. Harvests, prayers, births, the repair of a child's broken toy. History, for the many, was not yet a matter of treaties. It was the small business of continuing. A woman who spun and a man who mended shoes would live in the shadow of the great houses. And in their living, the kingdom's future would be finally decided more often than by any council or battle. At the end of the week, the king rode once more, not to war, but to see what had been done with his orders. He moved among towers whose stones were warm from a late sun, and men bowed, some with hope, some with calculation. He heard from captains and saw how the fortresses had been set in motion. Yet as he left, a courier at the gate pressed a sealed cloth into his hand. News from the southwest, from a place where trade and rumor met. Baldwin slit the cord and read in the courtyard. The letter's ink a blur of haste, of a convoy delayed, of a lord who withheld troops until his recompense was certain. The king's face, visible where flesh showed beside the mask, tightened like a cord. He understood, as any ruler must, that victory on a plain does not bind the wills of men forever. There would be more councils, more bargains, more nights in chapel. There would, he guessed with a hard and steady patience, a long contest measured by repair and by hunger as much as by lances. He wrapped the letter and gave it to a steward with a command to hurry and to an admonition that had less to do with law than with a plea. Bind your men together before need makes them apart. Beyond the city the horizon lay, the same as it had been the day of Montgisard, flat and deceptive, holding olive and ruin, promise and peril in equal measure. In that landscape the next moves were being made by many hands, by courtiers, by soldiers, by merchants, by men who kept wells, and by women who guarded them. The plain had taught them that simple truth: no victory is final, and no defeat is absolute. There is only the long work of keeping a place habitable, and the choices that men and women make in seasons when the world is not kind. When Baldwin returned to the palace that evening, the mask lay where he had left it beside the altar. He touched its edge, felt the cold of the silver, and then rose to give more orders. The work of defense, like the work of tending the sick, would not be finished in a day. He called for the lists of men who had been promised portions, and for the men who would carry store to the watchtowers. Outside, a distant horn sang from the sea. some ship, perhaps returning from the west, or from a small island that traded olives and salt. The sound moved across the plain, carrying with it goods and news, and the kingdom shifted, minute by minute, under a sky that could not be owned by any man.